Hello ladies and gentlemen, I'm Matt from Matt's Book Shelf, and today we are concluding our Ulysses discussion videos. So we last left off Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom. They just gone to a brothel. They met up at a hospital, and then they went to a brothel. And that's sort of the chapter where we get the deconstruction of both characters, where they're both basically put on trial for their mistakes and have to live with them and have to face them. We get the first real instance of Leopold being a fatherly figure to Stephen, and as you'll see in the preceding chapters, they leave the brothel, and that is where we will pick up. So with that said, let's get into the next chapter of Ulysses. So we pick up with Leopold feeling bad for Stephen because Stephen's in a very sorry state at this point. He's very drunk. He just had the vision of his mother visiting him, and then also the altercation with the British officers. So he's not really in a good state at this moment. So Leopold decides to bring him to another pub where they drink coffee. He stays away from booze, and they drink coffee and have another conversation. And we get to see what the characters have in common at this point, and how Leopold kind of views Stephen how Leopold views Stephen very fondly. So while at the new bar, while Stephen's sobering up, they start talking, and one of the things that they talk about, Leopold asks Stephen why he came back to Ireland and why he's on this giant drinking binge, and Stephen answers him to seek misfortune. So take that as what you will. It could be him dealing with depression for not visiting his mother while she was dying. It could be a whole myriad of reasons, perhaps guilt for leaving Ireland to pursue his artistic goals in Trieste. So it's more evidence of Stephen feeling guilty here. Further on, Leopold starts talking about how climate affects people's personalities, and to draw more Othello references, every time he talks about Molly, it has something to do with something in every scene looks Moorish, and draws comparisons to Othello, who is the Moor. And for the story of Othello, he's a foreigner working for an Italian military, and he's from Africa, and he's in a relationship with Desdemona, who is the daughter of a rich Italian aristocrat, Brabantio, and he's in the Moor, and the play basically discusses jealousy, and you can see that with Leopold as well. The two characters have many similarities, whereas Othello suspects Desdemona being unfaithful. So does Leopold. The thing is, Desdemona isn't unfaithful, and Molly is. And the other thing is that Leopold is incredibly unfaithful to Molly, and Othello is loyal to Desdemona. So it's both characters are dealing with extreme jealousy with a wife/girlfriend, and that's kind of the comparison there. But theories on climate and how it affects people's moods and attitudes is very prevalent in Othello, and it's an incorrect theory, but the general idea of it is that the white northerners of Europe are cool-headed, they are intelligent, whereas in warmer climates like in Africa they are typically more lazy and less intelligent, which is proven to be untrue in Othello, because Othello is a lot smarter than all the other Italian characters in the play. And we see here Leopold has very similar thoughts, so I'll read that section. Spaniards, for instance, he continued, passionate temperaments like that, impetuous as old Nick, are given to taking the law into their own hands, and give you your quietus double quick, with those poniards they carry in the abdomen. It comes from the great heat, climate generally. My wife is, so to speak, Spanish, half, that is. Point of fact, she could actually claim Spanish nationality if she wanted to, having been born, technically, Spain, i.e. Gibraltar. She has the Spanish type, quite dark, regular brunette, black. I, for one, certainly believe climate accounts for character. That's why I ask you if you wrote your poetry in Italian. And then Stephen hears us and just clearly dismisses the theory in general, but you get the idea that Leopold sort of judges Molly's character based on where she's from and based on her nationality. She's born from a warmer climate, therefore she's more, antagonistic, basically. And maybe that's something to do with why he fell in love with her in the first place. I would assume this isn't a new theory for him, but it's interesting to see that he could have potentially chosen Molly because of her, standoffish personality. And Molly, is actually somewhat, her personality is somewhat applicable to the climate theory that Leopold is presenting, because she is very independent, she's very strong-willed, but it's not, she doesn't fall completely in line with this sort of racist and generalizing idea of climate relating to someone's personality. And then Stephen changes the conversation pretty quickly to talk about art, because that's what he's passionate about, and he talks about how Irish nationalism and the sort of, the way it sort of groups people together is ultimately bad for people. It's ultimately bad for artistic achievement in Ireland. He accuses Charles Stewart Parnell of stripping people of the way of their individuality, and that war in itself is something that is destructive towards art and artistic pursuits. And I'll read that section also. The Boers were the beginning of the end. Birmingham, England, was toppling already, and her downfall would be Ireland, her Achilles heel, which he explained to them about the vulnerable point of Achilles, the Greek hero, a point of auditors at once seized as he completely gripped their attention by showing the tendon referred to on his boot. His advice to every Irishman was, stay in the land of your birth and work for Ireland and live for Ireland. Ireland, Parnell said, could not spare a single one of her sons. So whereas most of the characters in Ulysses, and for the most part in A Portrait of a Young Man, are very pro-Parnell, they agree with what he stands for home rule, for Irish nationality, for Irish independence. Stephen Dedalus is completely against it, as it would appear. He doesn't believe in Parnell's desire to define people as just being Irish, just to keeping them in the homeland and to give their lives for the cause. He's very much against that, and it shows that throughout his travels and getting more experience that his ideas in Portrait are only reaffirmed by his later experiences in life. And obviously Stephen being the Dedalus, and obviously Stephen being the Joyce character, we can safely assume that Joyce feels very similar ways. And just to go into some more highlights of this conversation they have in the bar, Leopold fantasizes to himself as to how he could kill Molly. Keep in mind that he knows that Molly and a character named Boylan are having an affair, and there's no real self-awareness here with him also having affairs and literally sexually harassing women unconsensually. And yeah, it's a very dirtbag kind of thing. But he fantasizes about it nonetheless. And then later on, he shows Stephen a photo of Molly when she was younger, and it's described in a very provocative way. It's not a naked photo or anything, but it's a more provocative photo. And he kind of shows it off, so he'll be like, oh yeah, this is my wife. And Stephen's not particularly into it, but it's pretty strange in that sense. And in the page after that, he starts talking about art and how it refers to women's bodies and the statuesque form, so I'll read that section as well. He dwelt being a bit of an artist in his spare time on the female form in general developmentally because, as it so happened, no later than that afternoon, he had seen those Grecian statues perfectly developed as works of art in the National Museum. Marble could give the original shoulders, back, all the symmetry, all the rest, yes, Puritanism, it does though, St. Joseph's Sovereign, whereas no photo could, because it simply wasn't art in a word. So to Bloom, in this passage at least, women are, or the ideal woman I guess, is art in itself. So if you think of a statue, it's the perfect statuesque body, but also no character. And it's, speaks on his obsession of the photos that he has as well. It's, it's women in their, sexualized form, their ideal bodily form, but with no speaking, just the object itself. At least at this point, his, being put on trial, basically, in the previous chapter is not really having an impact on him yet. Here, it gets better later on, as I will explain, but right now, it's funny how Stephen talks about art, and then Leopold's art is purely based on, his horniness and all that, and objectifying women, so there's that to deal with as well. But then, a couple pages later, perhaps the trial that he had does kind of click onto him, because in a way, I may be misinterpreting it, but he has the photo out, and then specifically Joyce writes he prudently put the photo away, which would suggest that perhaps he's embarrassed in a way, or he's trying to protect Molly's privacy. So maybe there's some learning here, just very very slow progressive learning, but it's interesting that he decides to put the photo away. It shows that he's perhaps seeing Molly again in a better light. He's not just trying to show off her body to other people because that's what he values the most about her. He's starting to see her as a person again, saying, hey, maybe she doesn't want to see this, or hey, maybe I shouldn't flaunt this provocative photo of my wife to people because it could be embarrassing for me as well. And this is kind of in addition to the scene at the hospital when that woman is giving birth, and he sort of is thinking admirably of Molly and how she went through childbirth. This is another scene where he sort of is kind of catching himself and saying, hey, why am I being so cruel to her? She's a person, and I admire her in many ways, and sort of resurrecting some of the old love that they had for one another. And that's basically where the chapter ends. The next chapter begins with Bloom deciding to take Stephen back to his home because he's clearly too drunk to walk home by himself, and they start discussing more, and we get some of their similarities and differences, which Joyce basically writes out what their similarities and differences are, and I'll read that part because I think it's kind of interesting. Of what did the duumvirate deliberate during the itinerary? Music, literature, Ireland, Dublin, Paris, friendship, women, prostitution, diet, the influence of gaslight, or the light of arc and glow lamps. On the growth of adjoining paraheliotropic trees, exposed corporation emergency dust bucket, the Roman Catholic Church, ecclesiastical celibacy, the Irish nation, Jesuit education, careers, the study of medicine, the past day, the maleficent influence of Presabeth, Stephen's collapse. Did Bloom discover common factors and similarities between their respective like and unlike reactions to experience? Both are sensitive to artistic impression, musical preference to plastic or pictorial. Both preferred continental to an insular manner of life, the cisatlantic and transatlantic place of residence. Both indurated by early domestic training and inherited tenacity of heterodox resistance, professed their disbelief in the orthodox religious, national, social, and ethical doctrines. Both admitted the alternately stimulating and obtunding influence of heterosexual magnetism. Were their views on some points divergent, Stephen dissented openly from Bloom's view on the importance of dietary and civic self-help, while Bloom dissented tacitly from Stephen's views on the eternal affirmation of the spirit of a man in literature. Bloom assented covertly to Stephen's rectification of the anachronism involved in the assigning the date of the conversion of the Irish nation to Christianity from Judaism by Patrick, son of Calpurnius, son of Potius, son of Odysseus, sent by Pope Celestine I in the year 432 in the reign Lieri to year 260 or whereabouts of the reign Cormac MacArt, suffocated by the imperfect deglutition of aliment at the Sletty and interred at Rosanary. And it's not particularly important to the plot, but I do like the idea that Stephen and Bloom kind of find similarities in their desires to separate themselves from doctrines, whether it be religious or nationalistic or really anything. They're both free-thinking people. I know Bloom does have some sort of artistic interest. Granted, you have like the Greek bodies, like the female Grecian statue thing, but perhaps there is some artistic merit in what he sees in there too that's not completely sexual. But, obviously Stephen has the love for literature, for poetry, and you see that in his conversation earlier with the students about Shakespeare. And I just find that interesting that they that's where they kind of have their heart-to-heart, basically, is in their respective desires to not be labeled as something outside of themselves, outside of their own personalities. They don't want to be, tied down to a certain creed or anything. They are purely individualistic people. And that's basically where the Stephen and Bloom interactions end. Stephen is eventually, sober enough to go out on his own, and you get the idea that Bloom is, quite enamored by Stephen. He wants to be his father figure, especially because he learned that Stephen and his father Simon don't have the best relationship. And Stephen is, not as crazy about Leopold. We don't really get Stephen's perspective in these chapters. That's mostly through Leopold. But you get the idea that, kind of like the Telemachus and Odysseus relationship, like this is like the start of a new father-son relationship here. And Stephen leaves, and you get the idea that they'll continue to see each other, and that they did kind of hit it off in like a father-son sort of way here in these chapters. And you sort of get a happier-ish ending for Stephen in this point, because this is the last time you'll see him in Ulysses. And from a man who was, had a bad relationship with his father and clearly with his mother as well, and now finding a father figure in his life, potentially it could, lead to better things for him and, kind of guide him out of, some of his more depressive moods that you see in Ulysses. And you get the idea that perhaps Leopold will find responsibility too. But then Bloom is left alone in his apartment, in his house, with Molly upstairs sleeping, and you get more of Leopold. You get more of Leopold's, views on life and his perspective on things. And I'm just going to read these two excerpts here because he clearly thinks a lot about natural law and humans' relationship to natural law. It's very existentialist in a way. And going off with what Stephen was talking about in Portrait of the Artist Young Man, he's also very much obsessed with the cosmos and seeing things in a cosmic sort of way in astronomy. So I'm going to read these two sections because I think they're very interesting in his perspectives on man's relationship, human relationship with everything else in nature, whether it be on Earth or in space. These remain the generic conditions imposed by natural as distinct from human law, as integral parts of the human whole, the necessity of destruction to procure aliment, elementary sustenance, the painful character of the ultimate function of separate existence, the agonies of birth and death, the monotonous menstruation of simian and particularly human females extending from the age of puberty to the menopause, inevitable accidents at sea in mines and factories, certain very painful maladies and their resultant surgical operations, innate lunacy and congenital criminality, decimating the epidemics, catastrophic cataclysms which make terror the basis of human mentality, seismic upheavals, the epicenters of which are located in densely populated regions, the fact of vital growth through convulsions of metamorphosis from infancy through maturity to decay. So in that section you get his sort of thoughts on like the craziness of life and how kind of how random certain things are, like getting sick, potentially, like all these sort of harmful things that happen to you, but they don't happen to you until they do happen to you, and leaving up to sort of cosmic chance in a way. There's craziness, but there's also order in the same way, and how sort of humans don't really have a choice and like what happens to them basically is what I gather from that. In addition to that, as he keeps thinking and this thought process continues, he kind of sort of focuses more on woman's relationship to the universe and to natural law, so I'll read that section as well. And maybe through this section you can maybe see some growth in his character. What special affinities appeared to him to exist between the moon and woman? Her antiquity in preceding and surviving successive Tellurian generations, her nocturnal predominance, her satellitic dependence, her luminary reflection, her constancy under all her phases, rising and setting by her appointed times, waxing and waning, the forced invariability of her aspect, her indeterminate response to an affirmative interrogation, her potency over effluent and refluent waters, her power to enamor, to mortify, to invest with beauty, to render insane, to incite and aid delinquency, the tranquil inscrutability of her visage, the terribility of her isolated, dominant, implacable, resplendent propinquity, her omens of tempest and of calm, the stimulation of her light, her motion, and her presence, her admonition of her crates, her arid seas, her silence, her splendor when visible, her attraction when invisible. So in contrast with literally just a couple pages earlier where he's sort of idealizing like the statuesque woman figure, the literal objectification of women, you see here that he's viewing women in a very complex form, the good and the bad from his perspective. Seeing Bloom think so deeply and so philosophically on that, and sort of thinking and sort of viewing women and all their complexities in a positive light here, perhaps shows that maybe he's sort of turning a new leaf here, hopefully. Perhaps, being put on trial like that, even though it was, pretty traumatic for him in the moment, maybe ultimately it will do him some good. And it sort of leaves hope for, Bloom the rest of his life to perhaps, change overall as a person. You can't expect him to change, one day, but this is from how they started in the morning to how he is at night is, basically light and day in itself. And then the chapter concludes with Bloom sort of going in depth as to his own feelings towards Molly's adultery, and he sort of, goes through his feelings of envy, jealousy, abnegation, and it's like he's like sort of like reflecting on himself here, because he goes up to the bedroom and he sees like, where Boylan was sleeping, and it causes him to really reflect on himself here, and he sort of kind of justifies his feelings that he can be mad because it's breaking like the matrimonial vows that they had together, and in a kind of funny passage he sort of contemplates what he can do to get back at Molly, and Boylan, so I'll read that part because it's pretty funny. What retribution, if any? Assassination? Never. As two wrongs do not make one right. Duel by combat? No. Divorce? Not now. Exposure by mechanical artifice? Automatic bed or individual testimony? Concealed ocular witness? Not yet. Suit for damages by legal influence or simulation of assault with evidence of injuries sustained, self-inflicted? Not impossibly. If any, positively. Connivance, introduction of emulation, material, a prosperous rival, agency of publicity, moral, a successful rival agent of intimacy. Deprecation, alienation, humiliation, separation. Protecting the one separated from the other, protecting the separator from both. By what reflection did he, a conscious reactor against the void, in certitude justify to himself his sentiments? The preordained frangibility of the hymen, the presupposed intangibility of the thing in itself, the incongruity and disproportion between the self-prolonging intention of the thing proposed to be done and the self-abbreviation and relaxation of the thing done, the fallaciously inferred debility of the female, the muscularity of the male, the variation of ethical codes, the natural grammatical transition of inversion involving no alteration of sense of an aorist preterite proposition, parsed as masculine subject monosyllabic onomatopoeic transitive verb with direct feminine object, from the active voice into its correlative aorist preterite proposition, parsed as feminine subject auxiliary verb, the quasi-monosyllabic onomatopoeic past participle with contemporary masculine agent. In the passive voice, the continued product of seminators by generation, the continued production of semen by distillation, the futility of triumph or protest or vindication, the inanity of extolled virtue, the lethargy of nescient matter, the apathy of the stars. I kind of like how when he goes through the options he has, all the ones that involve direct conflict with Molly or Boylan are completely ruled out. He's not going to confront him or try to kill him or fight him because he would probably lose. He's not going to try to, and he kind of rules out divorcing Molly because it would involve actually confronting her about it. But he does kind of consider harming himself to make it look like make it look like someone else attacked him. So completely wants to avoid any sort of conflict there. And then that other section that I read goes more into his idea of like the nature of the stars and how things are decided through the cosmos and beliefs like that, kind of going in line with what I had read earlier. But despite this one lapse in like his anger, because when he sees Boylan's like the outline of Boylan's body, he kind of just like loses it again. You do get the idea that perhaps what I read earlier with him, sort of viewing women in a more respective way again, and perhaps Molly as well, that maybe that will be what ultimately prevails. Because in the last 2 pages of Leopold's chapters, he talks about how they haven't had carnal sex since their youngest son, Ruby, died. So that was like 14 years ago. So it sort of draws a memory of them once as like a united family. And perhaps that image will be what, prevails throughout his, thought process of dealing with the grief and the jealousy, but also trying to hold on to the fact that, yes, he did once have a strong family. He did once have very strong feelings for Molly. And one would have to hope that the latter is what prevails. And, this sort of maelstrom of thoughts that goes on in Leopold's brain in this chapter. And then finally, we have the Penelope chapter, the last chapter of Ulysses, and it's purely from Molly's perspective. From the next morning, she wakes up, and the chapters are literally just pages of dialogue like this with very little space, because it's train of thought. It's the most train of thought, I would say, and there's very little punctuation as well. It's just purely her thought process, and it starts with her sort of being caught off guard by the fact that Bloom asked her to make him breakfast, which parallels the beginning of Ulysses where Molly asked Bloom to make him breakfast, and now she's kind of thrown off by that. And then that sort of triggers this thought process he has where, just to give a summary of what happens, she sort of, just says that she knows about Leopold's affairs. She knows about like the pornographic pictures he has on his desk, and that like she caught him masturbating to it once, and he tried to act normal about it, but she knew what was going on. He talks about Boylan and how she doesn't agree with some of his sexual kinks, if you will, and to make comparisons to Gertie McDowell in the last section, she sort of fantasizes about lifting her dress to show someone her underwear while they're masturbating, paralleling Gertie McDowell there. And you sort of get throughout this chapter her recollection of her past sexual events with partners, and the very interesting thread line throughout them all is that she's usually the one engaging in sexual acts themselves. So, she's very empowered in these scenes. She compares men to being like infants and like reflects on like if the world would be better if women were running it. And above many other things, there's more examples of her, engaging sexual contact with other men. There's, gender reversals there. And then there's also like potentially a lesbian romance with a woman named Herder that, lasts when she was younger. And they're sort of like aligned by the idea that they both like reading Wilkie Collins. So it shows their love of literature there. And also later on, another Gertie McDowell comparison. Keep in mind that Gertie is very much loves poetry, but she specifically says that she's willing to give up poetry if it means that she can find a husband. And then here we have Molly saying, I hope he's not a professor like Goodwin was. He was a patent professor of John Jameson. They all write about some woman in their poetry. Well, I suppose we won't find many like me, or softly sights of love and light guitar, or poetry is in the air and the blue sea and the moon shining so beautifully coming back on the night boat from Tarifa. The lighthouse at Europa Point, the guitar that fellow played was so expensive, well, I never go back there again. All new faces too, glancing eyes and lattice head. I'll sing that for him there, my eyes, if he's anything a poet. 2 eyes as darkly bright as love's own star, aren't so those beautiful words as love's young star. It'll be a change the Lord knows to have the intelligent person to talk about yourself. Not always listening to him and Billy Prescott's ad and Key's ad and Tom the Devil's ad. Then if anything goes wrong in their business, we have to suffer. Molly has interest in poetry as well. She doesn't name as much poets there, and then you kind of get her going into poetry itself, like writing poetry in her head as she's talking. Shows that perhaps maybe she potentially tried to write poetry herself at one point in her life, or maybe is writing it on the side, who knows. And then, as another comparison to Leopold, she says, like that lovely little statue he bought, I could look at him all day, long curly head, with his shoulders, his finger up, for you to listen. There's real beauty in poetry for you. I often felt I wanted to kiss him all over. So then you have like her worshipping of like a male statuesque figure there, and then this chapter's kind of crazy, so I'm going to be bouncing around a lot, but yeah, you have her worshipping the male statuesque figure like Leopold did earlier on with the Grecian statues of females, and then, but in a twist of fate, he sort of starts thinking about Bloom, and then we get the rejection of Boylan. She says, no, that's not the way for him, as he no manners, no refinement, nor know nothing in his nature, slapping us behind like that on my bottom because I didn't call him you the ignoramus that doesn't know poetry from a cabbage. As I said earlier, with Molly not liking his sexual kinks, he doesn't like being spanked, but Boylan does it to him anyways. And but specifically, she says he's distasted by his lack of love for poetry and literature, whereas Bloom likes poetry and literature. So you get that first turn where it's like, oh wait, we don't really have anything in common. She calls him ignoramus, that he's dumb. Like with Leopold, with Molly's sort of starting to have that revelation, like, hey, I do actually have a lot in common with my husband, and Boylan does not fill the void that Leopold does from a personality perspective, that she's more entwined emotionally with Leopold and also with Leopold's interest in literature as well. And then Molly, thinks about the death of her son very briefly, and, it's in a very sad manner as well, as you can imagine. But then, in a twist of fate, another twist of fate, the last 2 pages of Molly's chapter and the last 2 pages of Ulysses are her remembering the time where she and Leopold were in health, and Leopold proposed to her, and the passage is incredibly well written, and I can't do it justice, so I found a reading of it on YouTube, so I'll play the video for you here to really get the true appreciation for the prose that Joyce is using in this moment.
God of heaven, there's nothing like nature. The wild mountains, and then the sea, the waves rushing. And as for them saying that there's no God, well, I wouldn't give a snap of me 2 fingers for all their learning. Who was the first person in the universe before there was anybody that made it all? Who? That they don't know, and neither do I. So there you are. Might as well try and stop the sun from rising tomorrow. The sun shines for you, he said. The day we were lying among the rhododendrons on Hoth Head in the grey tweed suit and his straw hat. The day I got him to propose to me, yes. First I gave him the bit of seed cake out of my mouth, and it was leap year, like now, yes. 16 years ago. My God, after that long kiss, I near lost my breath, yes. He said I was a flower of the mountain, yes. And that was one true thing he said in his life. And the sun shines for you today, yes. And that was why I liked him. Because I saw he understood or felt what a woman is, and I knew I could always get around him. And I gave him all the pleasure I could, leading him on till he asked me to say yes. And I wouldn't answer first, only looked out over the sea and the sky, and I was thinking of so many things he didn't know. of Mulvey and Mr. Stanhope and Father and old Captain Groves and the Spanish girls laughing. And the sea, crimson sometimes like fire, and the glorious sunsets, yes. And Gibraltar as a young girl where I was a flower of the mountain, yes. And I thought, well, as well him as another. And then I asked him with my eyes to ask again, yes. And he asked me, would I to say yes, my mountain flower? And first I put my arms around him, yes. And I drew him down to me, so he could feel my breasts all perfume, yes. And his heart was going like mad. And yes, I said yes, I will, yes.
And that's where Ulysses ends, and perhaps there's a lot of bleakness in this book. There's a lot of morally gray acts going on and thoughts going on, but ultimately there is the sliver of hope that Molly and Leopold can get back together, sort of like in the Odyssey where Penelope and Odysseus get back together, despite there being some doubt there. The fact that Molly's last thoughts and Ulysses are fond ones of Leopold, sort of remembering what they have in common, their mutual love for art, and also like how much she loved him when they were first dating and when he proposed and when they first got married, and how that probably had gone bad, probably around the time of their son Ruby's death, purely with no fault of their own. And that last section, despite all the depressing things that happened in Ulysses, really ultimately gives you some hope at the end. And it's probably one of the best closing pages of prose I've ever read in my life. And it just really leaves you on this, excellent note, in my opinion. And with that said, that is the end of Ulysses. I hope you enjoyed the video. These videos are very rambling, and I apologize for that. But just trying to get my thoughts out there. Recently, I was talking to my advisor because I'm going back to school in September. And I'm recording this in August. I don't know when it's going to be published, but I'm going back to school soon. And we were actually talking about Ulysses. And he says that he reads it every other year. And at this point now, he's read it 20 times. And he says every time he reads it, he gets something new out of it. And I understand this is my first reading and that, my thoughts are going to be scrambled on it. But honestly, I can't wait to read it again at some point. Read it, probably multiple times at some point. Not anytime soon, but within the next few years, I could definitely see myself reading it because as I think about it, honestly, this is probably the best book I've ever read in my life. It might not be my favorite, but purely from how it explores different levels of prose, how it explores these incredibly complex characters, and how it takes advantage of the literary form in a way that this book could not be properly adapted in any way, in any other sort of form, whether it be film, as like a play or what have you, or a TV show. It just wouldn't happen. It's impossible in that way. And I've never really seen literature be explored in such complex ways before as Joyce has here in Ulysses. And ultimately, there were some, points in this book where I was really struggling with it. But having finished it, I can honestly say that I enjoyed the journey much more than I ever thought I would. And I'm very happy that I did the Road to Ulysses series because going through all Joyce's works has been one of my favorite, reading experiences, probably my favorite reading experiences in my life. And just having finished Ulysses and ends on such a great note where despite all his hardship, there's, potentially this sliver of hope between Leopold and Molly and Stephen representing Odysseus, Telemachus, and Penelope, and potentially forming a new family here is really, really sweet in a way, in that they're able to overcome these odds potentially. And I also want to apologize for the subject matter that we talked about as well. I hope that I addressed it properly. I have hopefully there are probably some sound bites here that will haunt me for the rest of my life as I had to read them out loud, but I think that Ulysses needs to be enjoyed and talked about in its fullest. Like, there's no real point in holding your punches when talking about this book. You just have to go, full in on the themes that Joyce discusses. And I hope that the series ultimately helped you with reading Ulysses if you decide to read along with me. And I'm glad ultimately that I did it, and I wouldn't take it back for anything, because Joyce is one of my favorite authors now, and I think that this will probably stand as one of the best reading experiences of my life. And I'm only in my 20s, so a lot to look forward to later on. And I feel so much more confident as a reader now in tackling difficult books now that I've done Ulysses. And I think that despite there being some hardships while reading it, I ultimately got a decent amount out of it, considering that it is my first read through, and that, like, at least from an emotional standpoint, I was able to connect with it, and that's kind of the most important part about it. And yeah, so I'm just kind of rambling at this point, but check out my other Ulysses videos if you're just getting to my channel now. I'm probably doing a channel update video pretty soon, talking about potential other series that I have in mind. Maybe I'll come back to Ulysses for like a grand final video thing, but I don't know. I'm sort of James Joyce out at the moment. And yeah, so let me know what you think of Ulysses, I guess, and if you found these videos to be helpful to you. So thank you. Check out my friends Colors Wonderland, Drunzo, and Drunzo's back, so you can stop commenting about him on my channel. He's back, he's alive, so it's okay. And our film podcast, Film Frauds. So check all this stuff out, and thank you if you made it this far, and I'll see you in the next video, hopefully. And goodbye.